Back in 2009, when Demon's Souls was first released, its very odd concept must have been a hard one to sell. The idea of a slow, unforgiving game that kicked the player down even more while they're already doing poorly, quite honestly, sounded insane at the time. It sounded like the kind of game you'd think of in the mid-80s to rip off little kids for their quarters, not something you'd suggest for the late 2000s, where frustratingly difficult games had long been pushed to the side. Against all conventional wisdom though, Fromsoft did exactly that, and against all conventional wisdom, it was a smashing success. While Demon's Souls wasn't where the term was popularized, it sowed the seeds of what would eventually turn into the Souls-like genre, an entirely new type of game created and ruled over by Fromsoft. They're the kings of the genre. That's the way it was 16 years ago, and that's the way it's been ever since. While there have been successes in the genre from other companies since then, they've always succeeded largely by adding in their own twist to the formula in order to appeal to a different audience. Nioh is for people who want a more comprehensive combat system, Blasphemous leans more on being a Metroidvania, Code Vein is for weebs. These are games that are trying to excel in an area that Fromsoft has long abandoned, not games that try to completely mimic and outdo them at what they do best. Simple combat with a heavier emphasis on grand boss designs and godlike exploration. Lies of P didn't try to do that though. It's a game that wanted to take those key aspects and, against all conventional wisdom, compete with Fromsoft straight up on their level. It wanted to flat out outdo them. It wanted to be a Souls game, no like included. And, in my opinion, it almost succeeded. While the base game of Lies of P had all the elements for a perfect Souls game, I felt it came quite a bit short in two really important aspects: level design and boss variety. These things aren't terrible in Lies of P, but not terrible isn't quite enough when you're trying to be the best. When you're trying to compete with games like Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and even Sekiro. Make no mistake though, I'm not saying that Lies of P isn't good. Falling just a bit short of Fromsoft still means you're an amazing game. Unrealistic comparisons aside, Round 8 Studios should still be extremely proud of the great experience that they've created. There's a reason why it was a contender for a lot of people's Game of the Year in 2023, mine included. Furthermore, Lies of P is just the studio's first attempt at a game like this. Imagine what they could do now that they have the benefit of hindsight and have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes. How a second or even a third game could take another step further beyond. Case in point, Overture. In a lot of ways, Overture is exactly what I asked for. A surprisingly hefty expansion to Lies of P with more of what made the base game so great. In other ways, it's even more, partly because it touches upon some of those issues with the base game that I mentioned, but also because it's a clear sign that Round 8 knows what they're doing and are improving. It's a sign that while they may not be at Fromsoft's level quite yet, they're heading in that direction. And maybe, just maybe, it's a sign that sometime in the near future, there's going to be someone new sitting on that throne. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this won't be a critique for the entirety of Lies of P. This is a video that is strictly about its DLC, Overture, and I'll be assuming for a vast majority of the video that you are familiar with Lies of P and all of its fundamentals. That means I won't be going over the simple but finely tuned combat system, the RPG mechanics that bolsters it even further, or anything to do with the story. The only time I'll ever even mention the base game is when I want to use it for comparison with the wholly new content that Overture has to offer, such as its new levels and their designs. This is a map of Vanini's workshop. It's the third major area from the base game and the example I'll be using when discussing level design in Lies of P. Before we go any further though, let's go over exactly how I made this map in the first place and what any of these symbols even mean. Basically, what I did was choose a stargazer at the start of a designated area and then considered every path that was available to me at that point. The line in the middle is what I deem to be the main path, the most straightforward and direct path through the level, and every other line originating from it I consider a side path, parts of the level that are either not necessary to complete it or are considerably more obscure than the main path. I keep on moving up the main path and incrementally fill in the side paths as I go along it until I reach the end of the area, usually at a boss, but not always. In addition, I only consider something a side path if it deviates enough from the main path or has a significant enough encounter tied to it. If a hallway splits into two for about 5 centimeters before rejoining, or if there's just a single room with an item and a couple of enemies in it, I won't be counting that as its own side path. For example, on this part of the map, there are technically 2 paths that do technically diverge. Avoiding this floor trap and falling into it technically lands you into 2 different places, but the conclusion and the reward for both of them is very similar. Staying on the floor above really only allows you to get these 2 enemies up here and collect a minor item. Outside of that though, there really isn't anything significant about taking one road or the other, which is why I chose to omit it from the map. If that still sounds rather arbitrary to you, then I'll just have to ask that you trust me when I say that this rule won't matter, and that I will be clarifying on why later in this section. As for the symbols themselves, the locks are locked doors or shortcuts. If there's an arrow attached to it, then that indicates the only side you can unlock it from. Stars are stargazers, i.e. checkpoints. The angry faces and the horned angry faces are mini-bosses and main bosses respectively. These triangles are trinity doors, and these dashed arrows are one-way paths where the direction they're pointing in indicates the only direction you are able to traverse them in. The last important thing I need to note is that the lengths of any of these lines don't really matter. None of these maps are drawn to scale in any sort of way. For example, this giant path around is really just one single pipe that you can lower for a shortcut. The far more important part is the number of lines on the map and when you gain access to them, not their lengths. If I had to describe this level in any way, I would say that it's just fine. There are a healthy amount of shortcuts that ensure that you'll always have a nearby checkpoint, the overall layout is complex enough to give off the sense of a real-lived place, and the level even has a nice little dilemma surrounding its mini-boss. That being fighting it right away for an early quartz, or exploring the level more to find a way to empty out the poison and even up the fight. With that being said though, there is one very crucial thing that Vanini's workshop gets wrong here, a prevalent issue throughout this entire map, and just the entire game of Lies of P in general. Exploration is incredibly linear. Don't get me wrong, I'm actually the kind of person who believes that linearity often gets a bad rap. It's not an intrinsically wrong thing to have in your video game. If the developers have a curated experience in mind and needs the extra control in order to execute on it, then linearity can actually be a really great thing. It's hard to pace a big moment or invoke a specific emotion when you give the player too many options to the point where they can approach it from any angle. In this case though, there's nothing like that going on. The game attempts something like this in the DLC, which I promise we'll get to soon, but for the base game of Lies of P, this sort of focused experience in the regular levels is completely absent. The levels are designed in a way that seems like it wants to encourage wandering about, but the game making exploration and progress through the level completely detached from one another completely betrays this vision. If you took this map and tried to draw a line through the level without ever having to backtrack, how many different lines could you make? The answer is 1. This one right here, which you may have noticed is just the main path. There aren't any meaningful decisions you get to make when it comes to actually progressing through the level. Just a bunch of dead ends and shortcuts to distract you here and there. Giving the players meaningful choices is almost always a good thing just in general, but it's even more important when you're talking about exploration. Choices reduce the artificiality of exploration, improves replayability, and rewards curiosity in a way that makes levels inherently more engaging to explore. To illustrate an example of a level that does this really well, let's jump over to this other obscure indie game that you probably never heard of called Dark Souls. This is a map from Undeadburg, one of the first areas in the game, and it follows the exact same rules I used for Liza P. Probably the first thing that sticks out to you like a sore thumb is the multiple connections to other zones. This is one of the coolest parts of Dark Souls level design in my opinion. The interconnected world and these connections allow you to approach levels from severely different angles and opt out of certain levels early if you wanted to. I wish Liza P did this as well, but I'm going to play fair here and strike out all of these extra connections because I don't believe that it's a really fair comparison that I should be making. Liza P is not going for an interconnected world, and bringing it up starts crossing into dangerous territory of me just wanting a different game. The only one I'm leaving in is Firelink Shrine, since there is a real argument that you can make that some people use it as a checkpoint, but other than that, I'm going to be ignoring the interconnected world entirely and just focus on the level itself. With that all out of the way, I want to walk you through all the decisions you can make throughout this level and how they might affect how a player can experience it. Right at the start of this main path, you immediately have your first decision on how you want to progress on this little bridge. You can either run across to this room with 3 enemies or drop down through this little gap on the side. Going the normal way means you have to fight these 3 enemies here and 3 enemies a little further ahead. It also allows you to explore 2 houses and kill the enemies that have been firebombing you. On the other hand, dropping down skips all of that, but forces you to engage with a Black Knight, a rather tough enemy but by no means unbeatable. These 2 paths are clearly made for 2 different types of people. If you're confident, in a rush, or just stubborn, then dropping down is most likely the path you'll take since it's the shortest one and takes the most skill. However, if you want to explore more or you don't think you can take on the knight, then running across the bridge is your best bet. Neither of these paths are wrong, by the way. They both make a meaningful amount of progress through the level on their own, meaning if you wanted to completely ignore the other one, you can. The game leaves that decision up to you. After beating the Taurus demon and most likely getting roasted, you end up here on this bridge where you have another decision. Either find a way past the dragon up above, or chicken out and go under it instead. I say chicken out, but this is probably the path that most people took on their first playthrough. I know that on my first time, I got frustrated trying to run past the dragon and quickly gave up for the quote-unquote intended path. Doing so is more straightforward, but has the drawback that you don't get access to the bonfire in this building, so every run back from that point on is way more brutal. While the dragon is a bit scary, it is the better path overall. It just involves a little experimentation to bypass it. After that, the next decision is just a couple steps away with the metal boar and the open gate. While it is a little unintuitive, there are still 2 paths here that both progress through the level. Either run past all the enemies through the gate, or fight the boar straight on. Running past the boar before the gate can close is actually fairly easy. The hardest part, honestly, is noticing it's an option in the first place, but once you do, it is unquestionably the most expeditious way through the level. On the other hand, you can just fight the boar straight up for more souls and items, but doing so usually takes long enough for one of the undead to close the gate route off. This makes you take a detour around the gate where you'll eventually reconvene with the other path at this chapel. This is your last decision. Either go in from the front and fight these 3 boulder knights, or find a way around the building to skip them instead. In total, Undeadburg has 16 unique ways you can beat it, and even if you want to disregard the gate path for its obscurity and one-time nature, that's still 9 times more ways compared to Vanini's Workshop's singular path. Trying to do a walkthrough of that level in a similar manner to this one would be impossible, because there aren't any real decisions in Vanini's Workshop in terms of progressing it. There's only one single path through. If you played Dark Souls before, then you probably noticed that this map is missing a lot of things such as the Dark Knight on this tower, this house which can pseudo-skip some enemies, Lautrec, Havel, and even Solaire. Just to be clear, I did not leave these things out for time efficiency's sake. I left these things out because I wanted to be fair. I said that I didn't think that these things significantly affected exploration, and I meant it. This is why I said earlier that me omitting certain sections from Liza P didn't really matter, because I knew for sure that I omitted more from Undeadburg, and it still has the better level design. It's clear that Fromsoft knew what they were doing when making this level. They didn't need to spam shortcuts every 5 minutes because the moment-to-moment decisions that you can make throughout the level made it feel fuller, even if its layout is overall less complex than Vanini's Workshop. That's the one thing that I can give Vanini's Workshop over Undeadburg. The layout is much better at giving off the illusion that it's a real place and not a level in a video game. Undeadburg is simple but effective, and while that is preferable to complicated but linear, there is a way to go even further beyond. If Vanini's Workshop is fine and Undeadburg is good, then this next level is simply a work of art. This is Stormveil Castle from Elden Ring. If you were getting tired of the play-by-play style I did for Dark Souls 1, then you'll be happy to hear that I won't be doing the same thing for Stormveil Castle. Partly because I really, truly do want to talk about Overture in the next 30 minutes or so, but also because this map on its own should be enough to get my point across. If you were wondering, this is the main path. Running through the gate past the ballistae seems like the most straightforward and direct route to me, but this entire side path might as well have been a level all on its own. There are so many possible routes, and the level was so complex in its geometry that it was genuinely difficult to draw. I even had to resort to using blue in order to indicate paths that are separate from the ones that they had to intersect. As for the total number of ways you could complete this level, yeah, I'm not doing that. Someone way smarter than me can do it if they want to, but even thinking about every single conceivable way you could beat this level is enough to give me an aneurysm. Stormveil Castle fires off on every cylinder. Complexity, decision-making, rewards, aesthetic, bosses. The fact that it's in Elden Ring, probably the game with the most excuse not to have this complex of a level design, is quite frankly insane. It's the standard that I think that every single Souls-like should strive for, and one that Liza P unfortunately doesn't even come close to attempting. I hope that by giving out these examples and comparing them to Vanini's Workshop, that I properly communicated why I thought the exploration in it was so disappointing. It's a lot of dead ends and shortcuts, where the most engaging thing it ever makes you think is, oh, this path hasn't ended for a while, I should probably go back for more items. Still though, some of you might be thinking to yourselves that comparing it to the legacy dungeons in Elden Ring is a bit too harsh. Fromsoft has had almost 2 decades of experience to fall back on when it comes to level design. Saying that Liza P would fall short of that is a no-brainer. Some might even call it unfair. At the end of the day, Liza P's level design is fine, and that's fine, right? Unfortunately, there's a critical piece of information here that is missing, something you've hopefully noticed by now that is really important when it comes to critiquing Liza P's level design in a truly fair manner. What about every other level besides Vanini's Workshop? The choice of Vanini's Workshop as my example should have seemed really odd to you. It's an early level where the design might not be as complex, and it doesn't really mark any notable change in the game's pacing or anything like that. If you had guessed that I was cherry picking this whole time, then you would actually be 100% correct, but not in the way that you may think. I didn't cherry pick Vanini's Workshop because it's the worst level in Liza P. I cherry picked it because it's actually one of the best levels in Liza P. For example, this is a map of Elysian Boulevard, and this is a map of your revisit of Kratz Central Station. By all means, these levels aren't just fine, they're terrible. Admittedly, this is as bad as it ever gets, but most of the other levels only fare a bit better. They're like if you took the simplicity of Undeadburg and filled it to the brim with shortcuts instead of branching paths. For as linear as Vanini's workshop is, at least it had some redeeming qualities like its layout. Most of these other maps miss out on that though. My insistence that it's only shortcuts and dead ends is easier to see here more than ever. The next best level is probably either the Swamp or Lorenzini's Arcade, but even those levels suffer from the exact same linearity problem as all the others. Every other map is on a scale from underwhelming to awful, which is why I can't bring myself to say that as a whole, Lies of P has fine level design. Finally though, we can start talking about the DLC to Lies of P Overture. I apologize that it took so long to get to this point, but level design is a rather complicated topic to talk about, and I didn't want to simultaneously jump between all these examples while also discussing all the new stuff on hand. I wanted to set out my standards as plainly and clearly as possible so I could give the DLC my full undivided attention. With all of that out of the way, it's finally time I answer the main question. Does Overture fix any of the issues I had with the base game in terms of level design? The answer is no. The next thing we'll be talking about in this video is the bosses. First though, we'll need to take a quick little detour over to this little obscure indie game that outside of a few specific moments, the levels in the DLC mainly follow the exact same pattern as the ones in the base game. Very linear levels with a fair amount of shortcuts to make the runbacks not as rough, and not much more. In fact, most of them are arguably worse than even the levels that the base game had to offer. The greenhouse and the circus both kind of get a pass because how short they are, but the shipwrecked field and Rhodes Estate are just underwhelming with no real excuse. Next is the Zealot's underground facility, which is probably the second best traditional level of the DLC thanks to its layout, but in the end, it's still quite linear. Finally, there's Plimora's Forest Cave and the Zoo, which in my opinion are the two best areas in the DLC, though for two completely different reasons. Plimora's Cave is unquestionably the most linear level in the entirety of Lies of P, but whereas every other level has linearity as a shortcoming of their level design, Plimora's Cave actually uses linearity to its advantage. This entire section is more of a story moment between Pinocchio and Leia. It's essentially a long gauntlet of enemies that you two fight through with no checkpoints in between. Working with Leia here and bonding with her is the point. The game uses this section to get you more attached to her so that the payoff of what happens next in the story can hit that much harder. This is probably as good a time as ever to tell you that I won't be covering the story of Overture at all. Not because I don't think it's good or bad or anything like that, but because I really don't play these kinds of games for the story, and truthfully I do zone out whenever it comes up. Even being as disinterested as I was though, this whole sequence still worked on me. Going from tearing through enemy after enemy with Leia as a team to then immediately having to see her break down moments later actually had some impact. This is what I meant earlier when I said that linearity isn't inherently a bad thing. You just have to use it right. If this level had been some sprawling open-ended dungeon where you could just fap about forever, then the emotional moment following it simply wouldn't have hit the same beats. In this instance, the more linear and focused experience is just the better way to go about it. Added with the uniqueness of this entire sequence compared to the rest of the game, and it's hard for me to call this level anything else but a success. I don't want every level to be like this one, but its inclusion in the game's current state is more than welcomed. For an example of a level that is better in a more traditional way, you have Kratz Zoo. This level has the most branching paths, has the most interesting enemy types, and is the most memorable visually. I think its layout is a bit too simple, but it's at least approaching a Dark Souls 3-esque quality that I can at least respect. Unfortunately, this one level can't save the other ones in the DLC. It's definitely more of the exception rather than the rule. If you're the type of person who cares way more about the combat or the bosses, then I understand that this entire section might seem like it doesn't warrant this much attention. But for me, exploration is a giant part of why I enjoy the Souls games in the first place, and I'm disappointed that even with the DLC, Liza P couldn't quite nail it. Thankfully, I can't say the same about the bosses. While not every boss in the base game was a complete banger, in general their overall quality was quite good. There weren't really any that I can expressly say that I hated or felt mediocre to me. The rematch with the Black Rabbit Brotherhood can be a bit annoying because of their aggro range, but I still think that's an okay fight, and that's as bad as it ever gets. The consistency of the boss quality is obviously a very good thing, but part of the reason why it can achieve such a thing in the first place is by making the strategy for all of them very similar. With only one giant exception, there aren't any bosses in this game that made me think in a different way or change up what I was doing. I'm going to go in, learn their patterns, and get good enough at parrying them in order to win was generally how I approached every single fight, and never did the game make me think to try anything else. Having the same strategy work for every single boss can get a bit boring. It usually shows that while timings and patterns switch around, they really aren't that different after all. Obviously, their visuals and designs are different, but how different they are mechanically is equally important, if not more. There were some quirks to the bosses, but they've always had such a small impact on the fight that they barely ever mattered. For example, Archbishop Andreas' Phase 2 has two different sides which both have their own unique movesets. While the fight starts on the bishop side, you can run around the boss over to the monster side if you want to switch to the other moveset, and vice versa. In theory, this sounds really cool. Giving the player a decision on which side they want to fight based off their preferences is a neat little twist on the typical boss formula. In practice though, there's very little reason anyone wouldn't just choose to stick to the monster side and stay there for the rest of the fight. Its moveset is very similar to Phase 1, the damage you do to both sides is roughly equivalent, and it's much easier to hit. There isn't any real trade-off you have to make here, nothing to seriously take into account that makes you consider which side is better. Once you have all the information, sticking to the monster side is just clearly the correct option, at which point the whole thing turns into a traditional Phase 2 fight. Another example of a marginal gimmick is the Black Rabbit Brotherhood fight. The idea behind this one is that you fight the eldest brother normally, but at certain thresholds of his health, it switches to a fight with one of the siblings instead. From here, the siblings will be the only one aggro to you, but occasionally the eldest will run in for a swing. To avoid this, you have to use a sound cue which lets you know when he's attacking, at which point dodging him without even looking is very much a possibility. Again, the use of a sound cue of all things in order to dodge an attack is really interesting, but realistically, it's only a single attack in an entire fight. Every other move they have is completely normal. To be clear, I'm not saying that I want full-on gimmick fights like the folding screen monkeys from Sekiro or Bed of Chaos from Dark Souls 1. I just want something different enough to diversify the way I approach them. Maybe I can better communicate what I mean by bringing up that one exception I mentioned earlier, the Puppet King, Romeo. This is outright my favorite boss in the entire game, not just because I think he looks cool and has a great moveset, but also because in a game where every single boss leans so heavily on parrying to beat, he's the one boss where it flat out isn't worth it. If you compare the three main defensive options in the game, dodging, guarding, and parrying obviously wins out as the best option for 90% of attacks. It can be used with no stamina, increases staggers on enemies, and has the most specific upgrades to make it even better. I know it's possible to beat the game with only guarding or dodging, but parrying has so many different advantages that most players will naturally be pushed into doing it for a majority of their playthrough. The Puppet King turns that on its head though, in that the best response to most of its attacks is actually to dodge them instead. For once, parrying is outright the inferior option. Many of his attacks in phase 1 send you so far back and stunt you for a bit, making counterattacking really difficult. You can still get some stagger progress in, but it's arguably not worth the 3 or 4 good hits you could get if you simply dodge through the attack instead. He still has some attacks worth parrying, but the presence of moves that encourage dodging instead pushes you into mixing the two together instead of relying on mostly one. That might sound really minor to some of you, and in a way, it is. I think that in some ways, King of Puppets doesn't push this concept far enough, but it's still something that makes his fight stick out. He reminds me a bit of Owl Father from Sekiro, in that the best way to beat him is by treating half of the fight like a traditional Dark Souls boss, and then switching back to Sekiro mode for the other half. Exactly half of the 6 main bosses in Overture managed to do something to this effect: Anguished Guardian, Arlecchino, and Marchiona. Since Arlecchino and King of Puppets share a lot of the same positives with one another, let me talk about him first while those talking points are still fresh. The most unique thing about this fight is the heal punish in phase 1. If you panic heal after he's done with the combo, he can immediately respawn and continue with a unique extension. While input reading isn't exactly a stranger to the Souls-like genre, in Lies of P it's actually fairly unique. For most bosses, after their combo is done, it's done, and healing straight in their face is usually completely fine. Arlecchino makes you rethink that habit though, forcing you to gain some distance or return to neutral if you want to be completely safe for healing. He still has a response if you heal like this, but for this one, it's actually possible to respond to his response, so it's still safe as long as you're ready. In addition, he only punishes healing. Attacking him after a combo is completely fine, so this quirk of his doesn't slow down the fight in any way, and thankfully rewards aggression. It's a nice little wrinkle on how you think about healing that I really like, and to further praise it, it also is perfectly communicated, so there's almost no guesswork here. Unfortunately, he doesn't keep this trait for his phase 2, but the overall moveset for that phase is still pretty unique. Simply put, phase 2 is King of Puppets on steroids. While that fight had the mixing of dodging and parrying as a strong suggestion, this one has it as a straight up requirement. In total, Puppet King had 2 attacks that needed to be dodged, and that's shared between both phase 1 and phase 2. In comparison, this one phase of Arlecchino has 7. 2 different variations of a grab, and 5 that leave this red mist on the floor that explode. In addition, they often come quickly after or before a move that's better parried, so weaving both of these defensive mechanics together is more necessary than ever. It's everything I liked about King of Puppets turned to 11, and I love it. It doesn't hurt that he also has the hardest defensive check in the entire game, an insane pattern that is equally as insanely satisfying to parry. Arlecchino might just be my favorite fight in all of Lies of P, but admittedly he's not the most unique. If we want to take a step closer to that, then we have to continue on to the 4th boss in the DLC, Anguished Guardian. This fight's unique gimmick is the 2 parts of his body that are breakable, his bottom left hand and his head. While the base game had breakable weapons that could nerf the boss if you parry them enough, these parts have some key differences. For one, attacking is unquestionably the best way to break these parts. While parrying like normal can still do damage to them, it only does so if the character model makes direct contact with it, which isn't always possible for every attack. This means that breaking these parts is more proactive. You can't passively sit by and wait for them to break, you have to go out of your way and target one. Next is the fact that there are obviously 2 of them now, which means you actually have a decision on which one you want to break first based on their respective payoffs. At first, the hand seems like the better part to prioritize. It's easier to break, alters a certain move for a bigger opening, and also causes the boss to receive double damage once broken. Breaking the head also shares that last point, but since it's much harder to crack, the amount of damage you can pile up over the course of the fight is theoretically much less. However, that doesn't mean that breaking the head first shouldn't be considered for one simple reason. Unless you break the head, this boss can flat out never be staggered. Staggers are by far the biggest reward in the entire game. It's most of the reason why I consider parrying to be the best defensive option. With it gone, not only is the game once again encouraging the mix of dodging and parrying, but it's also dangling your biggest payoff right in front of your face, locked behind having to target a specific part of the boss. Along with the fact that the head is much easier to hit overall, and I can see a reasonable argument that focusing on the head first for the stagger is much more important. Maybe it's because I'm a giant Monster Hunter fan, but this idea of having to target and break a specific part of the boss is something that appeals to me greatly, and I hope that they go even further with this concept in the next game. With those two out of the way, we finally come to the last and most unique boss in not just Overture, but in all of Lies of P in general, Marchiona. Multi-boss fights have always been a tricky thing to pull off for Souls games. The high commitment attacks and lack of movement options that typically come with these types of games usually make these fights more of a test of patience than of skill. Unless you like wasting healing, you usually have to wait for both bosses to coincidentally end their attacks at the same time in order to respond. Depending on the bosses, I can see that taking anywhere up to 15 seconds, which in gamer time might as well be an eternity. One way that developers have circumvented this issue is by making it so that only one boss can aggro to you at a time. This way, attacks can't overlap, and now the player can have a reasonable window to attack or heal. This is what the base game of Lies of P did with its two multi-boss fights, and while I think it's better to have this than nothing, this method can feel a little cheap. The fun of a multi-boss fight should be in its ability to test your multitasking skills while also making you feel as though you're weaving through multiple combatants at once. Having the bosses queue up like this instead makes the whole thing feel like a collection of single boss fights lazily daisy-chained together. They aren't actually working with one another, they're just waiting in line. Marchiona takes the far more interesting route in making the bosses be two different entities, but always has them attacking in unison with one another. This carries along all the benefits of a multi-boss fight, while also leaving behind all the things that typically makes them frustrating. Keeping your eye on both of them is still important to identify their attacks, but since in reality their attacks are working around each other, you can always find windows to attack and heal once they're done. This is all also extremely well communicated to the player. You can tell who's attacking based on the color of the strings Marchiona is holding. Blue means that she's attacking, and red means the puppet is. It might sound like a small touch, but because of it, I always knew exactly when I should switch over to the other boss, and I never felt like I got cheaply hit from out of nowhere. The other wrinkle to this fight is the decision on who to target first. The battle only really ends when you kill Marchiona, but taking down the puppet first does a lot of free damage to her and also gives about a minute to fight her all by herself. Making the most out of this window is important, and I think that the most effective strategy here is to weaken the puppet really badly, but not destroy it until Marchiona hits her phase 2. That phase has more moves and the puppet becomes more dangerous than ever, so reducing the amount of time the fight is spent on it makes a lot of sense. The other option is to just ignore the puppet entirely. The puppet has less health for sure, but it's by no means insignificant, so you could make the argument that only aiming for Marchiona is the fastest way through. Just live with the puppet attacks and keep on aiming for the only health bar that actually matters. I really don't know which one of these methods is more effective. In theory, aiming for only Marchiona seems like it would be faster, provided that you're good enough, but the free damage along with the temporary 1v1 might make up the difference. This is what I meant when I said that I wanted bosses to change the way that I think. I want them to switch up how I approach a fight and consider different angles. It's something that I never had to do in the base game, and the fact that the DLC made me do it twice arguably thrice is inarguably a great thing. The only real complaint I have with this fight is that the camera can get a bit too frenetic, though that only really happens when you lock on to the puppet for too long. Having Morgiona as your main target and swapping only to the puppet for a short burst gets rid of this problem altogether, and it might even be part of the boss's intended design considering how much she rips that thing around. The other bosses in the DLC fall into the exact same mold as the bosses from the base game. Maybe they'll have an ailment to inflict on you or something, but they're all beaten by just learning their patterns and parrying. Thankfully, the good thing about having unique bosses in your game's lineup is that by extension, they make even the more standard fights more unique as well. After all, individuality is really only measured against everyone else. That's my fancy way of saying that I didn't mind that the other bosses shared a strategy because the DLC mixes things up enough in order for it to not feel stale. The only one that I didn't really like was Lumachino. It's a surprisingly long fight with 3 different phases, the first 2 being slightly different variations of a standard humanoid fight, and the last one being an infected monster that inflicts decay. Standard human fights were something that the base game of Lies of P struggled with a bit, and it's really not much better here. For as simple as the overall moveset is, the first 2 phases last way too long, aided by the fact that the opportunity to attack Lumachino is very limited, and this whole thing can feel like it's dragging on just a bit. Usually how this fight will go down is you parrying his string of attacks, getting in a single poke, and then having to back off. Repeat about 24 times to get to phase 3. Phase 3 is more interesting and is overall much better than the first 2, but can't really save how underwhelming this boss fight is as a whole. Even despite this fight though, I still think that the overall quality of bosses in the DLC is still very high. It's inarguably a clear step up from the bosses in the base game, with the trio that I discussed earlier being some of my favorite bosses across the entire thing. If you enjoy Souls-likes a lot, then it might have bothered you that throughout this whole section of talking about just the bosses, that I didn't mention their overall difficulty even once. That's because I believe that difficulty is an extremely messy topic to discuss. Summons, item use, legion arm choice, weapon choice, stat choices, gaming experience, how hard or how easy a game is will ultimately have to take into account all of these factors, and I just don't think that it's worth it. The most factual statement that I can make is that on the hardest difficulty without using summons, the DLC was fairly hard for me, with the last boss in particular taking about 2 hours. I guess if you know me, you can use that as a reference for your own experience, but that's about it. In the end, this sort of thing will always come back to the dreaded "it depends" statement that I hate using. It'll be easier for some people, it'll be harder for some people. That's not really a useful statement that really says anything, right? If you need to know how difficult the DLC is because you're afraid that it might be too difficult though, then all I can say is to not worry. Because it's probably not. And it has difficulty modes now. While not explicitly tied to the DLC, coinciding with its release, Lies of P made the rather bold decision of adding difficulty modes that make the game easier and more accessible. Awakened Puppet and Butterfly Guidance. This might sound really minor to those who haven't played many Souls games, but explicit difficulty modes like this is something that, to my knowledge, no other Souls-like has ever done before. It's also an incredibly touchy subject within the Souls community, one that can spark a lot of debate about the game's relationship with difficulty and produce a lot of toxicity from both sides, just to be clear. Just so you know where I stand, I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with preferring easier games or preferring harder ones. Many people online have tried to psychologically analyze others for what they prefer, trying to dissect what sort of person they are based off the games that they play, and altogether make very rash judgments in order to discredit any arguments that they might have on the matter. Something along the lines of, well, if you want the game to be easier, then that just means you have no determination, or don't like learning, or if you want the game to be harder, well, that just means you have an ego issue or are insecure. You know, something like that. While this might sound hypocritical coming from a guy who made a 40+ minute YouTube video analyzing a video game, this kind of logic is just overthinking things. People prefer what they prefer. No psychoanalysis required. The reason I think I'm comfortable with making this statement in the first place is because at the end of the day, video games are a very small part of most people's lives. Maybe someone does like learning and improving, but just in an area that isn't a video game. You know, like their job or their hobby that they're infinitely more passionate about. Maybe someone is perfectly secure with who they are and their abilities, but challenging games give them an escape from the boring monotony of their everyday life. I'm not saying that the challenged adverse or the egomaniacs don't exist, but trying to draw that conclusion solely based off a couple of factors, and then using it as an argument to why or why not difficulty modes should exist in these games is wrong. Obviously, I won't be doing that. Instead, I'll simply be bringing up the pros and the cons of having these modes, and then go from there to see if they're overall a good or a bad thing. The first downside that immediately comes to mind is that the gameplay becomes much more difficult to discuss with other people because the community gets a bit segmented into these 3 difficulties. If you've ever had the pleasure of bringing up how much trouble you had with a boss only for someone to swat it away with, what, that fight was easy, or you not using summons, or it's really not that bad once you craft these very specific items, then you know what I mean. Once again, I'm not saying that one style is more valid than the other or anything like that. I'm saying that the more ways there are to bypass certain challenges, the harder it becomes to discuss them with other people. If, for example, you played on the easiest difficulty mode, then the points I made about the uniqueness of the bosses in the DLC might have seemed like an over-exaggeration. That's because on the easier difficulties, everything I said in that section about the bosses becomes less relevant since brute forcing your way past certain mechanics becomes more and more likely. If you crank it up in the other direction though, like I did, then these differences between the bosses all of a sudden become extremely important. Their uniqueness becomes more pronounced the more and more you're forced into noticing them. The second downside is that difficulty modes give players yet another way to ruin their own enjoyment. As insanely patronizing as this might sound, a lot of people really suck at having fun. The thought that someone will prematurely turn the difficulty down when in reality they would have preferred overcoming a challenge instead is a very real possibility. Just so I don't come across as too biased though, I also want to make it clear that this can happen the other way around. Making the game too hard can also go awry. When I was younger, I thought that I wanted every open world Bethesda game to be on the hardest difficulty, because I was quote unquote hardcore and wanted a quote unquote challenge. In reality though, all playing on the hardest difficulty really did was detract from the exploration and progression systems that those games excelled at. It also, in a way, made combat even worse because it now revolved around exploiting the AI, which is funny for about 2 seconds and gets really annoying at 3. Nowadays, whenever it's clear that the combat is going to take a back seat, I always play on a standard difficulty mode, and those types of games are genuinely better for it in my opinion. I believe that giving players choices is almost always a good thing, but these kinds of situations are usually why I have to include the almost in that sentence. Sometimes narrowing down their options and forcing someone into playing a specific path really is the best way for them to have fun, as strange as that might sound. These are the only 2 downsides I can think of that hold any sort of water, but in the interest of being thorough, I think it's only fair that I go over some of the other arguments I've heard over the years against difficulty modes and why I don't quite buy them. The first and most common one is that the difficulty of these games and their uncompromising nature is integral to immersing players into the world. Souls games tend to go beyond just looking bleak and hopeless because they make you feel hopeless as well. They aren't hard just for the sake of being hard. Putting you into the ground over and over again is more so to drive home the cruelty of these fictional worlds and the depressing state that they're in. Like a cockroach though, you just keep on coming back over and over and over again, and with enough determination and insight, you can still continue and move on, despite how hopeless things may have seemed. That's the magic of a good Souls game. If you could beat everything on your first try, then that feeling is simply not there. This is an argument that I actually do agree with. I buy into just about everything that was just said here about immersion. The problem is that this idea that the difficulty adds to immersion doesn't at all conflict with having difficulty modes because difficulty is relative. If someone with a ton of experience with action games played on the second hardest difficulty, then of course they wouldn't get the same immersive experience if they had played on the hardest one. But imagine someone who sucks at these types of games being put in that exact same situation. It would still be difficult for them. They would still struggle. They can still get the same immersive feeling because turning the game from almost impossible to only excruciatingly brutal still has the same effect. Difficulty modes essentially allow everyone to scale the game to how good they are as a player, and as long as everyone stays in their appropriate difficulty levels, the immersion factor should still remain intact. The next argument is that difficulty modes take away time and budget from a game and aren't as easy to integrate as one may think. This is an argument that I can't engage with because I have never personally developed a video game in my entire life. If it turns out that difficulty modes are some Herculean task that requires the sacrifice of some key content or optimization, then I admit I would almost always prefer those things over difficulty options. I can't imagine that being the case, but I also will admit that I don't know that for sure, along with pretty much everyone else who makes this argument in the first place. If I'm wrong here, then I'm wrong, but once again, I imagine as long as the developers know what they're doing, that it shouldn't be too much of an issue to add easier difficulty modes. That's what I think, and for now, that's the side I have to stick to. The last argument isn't really about difficulty modes, but more so about the entire gaming industry as a whole and the place that Souls-like games tend to occupy. It's the idea that the whole point of a Souls-like is to be difficult, that there are already a deluge of easy, cozy, and relaxing games that allow you to go at your own pace. If someone doesn't want to be challenged, then they should just play one of those games, instead of ones whose entire existence relies on the idea that it's supposed to be hard. In other words, difficulty isn't just part of the gameplay, it is the gameplay. The idea is that lowering the difficulty is akin to transforming the game into an entirely different genre. Trust me when I say that I know how unfair it can feel to like something, only for people who never cared for it in the first place try and change it into something else. The fear that eventually people who prefer more challenging games will be pushed to the side is a feeling I can sympathize with. It resembles how I feel about old gen Monster Hunter versus the new gen ones. But that's all it is really, a resemblance and a feeling. Realistically, these difficulty options won't do anything like that anytime soon. And you wanna know how I know that? I know that because barring Sekiro, every single Souls game has a mechanic that is explicitly designed to make the game easier. Lies of P had something like this already, and yet the bosses in the DLC are still some of the hardest in the entire game. Hard games are still being pumped out. It's not a sign that the devs are going soft or that truly difficult games are being pushed to the side. These options just allow more people to play the game. That's the main argument that the opposite side of the debate usually uses to justify the inclusion of difficulty modes, and while there is another one here about improving replay value, this one here is the only one that they really need. More people get to experience the game. More people get to appreciate the visuals, the boss designs, and the story firsthand. People often try to equate this to dumbing down stories in movies or TV shows for people who lack media literacy, another case of no one gets left behind gone too far. The crucial difference here though is that these difficulty options are just that, they're options. The hard mode still exists. If you don't like the easier modes, then you can just ignore them. It's like being upset that an amazing book has a Cliff Notes version. That version does not take anything away from the original. No one is losing anything from its mere existence. As long as the difficulty modes are done right, and everyone stays in their right lane, everything should be fine. Maybe that's the real issue here, that there's a lack of trust for either the developers or the players to handle these modes correctly. But that's not really a problem with difficulty modes. It's a problem with people. And yeah, some people suck, no arguments here, but is it worth not trying to help the people who could really use it? People who want to see the rest of the game and are legitimately trying their best, but are just not able to progress. I don't think that it is. These difficulty modes are still a trade-off in my mind, but I definitely think it's one worth taking. Maybe this is being too optimistic, but I really do think that Round 8 Studio will continue to handle difficulty in the correct way, while also patching up all the rough areas that they seem to fall short in. Almost every change from release till now has been nothing but improvement after improvement, some of which I haven't even gone over in this video. Overture might not have fixed everything, but it added and fixed enough to make me feel confident in this studio's future. It makes it abundantly clear that they're big fans of the genre and are interested in improving in the areas that previously gave them trouble. Overture marks a large improvement in their boss design philosophy, and hopefully whatever they have cooking up next can tackle their underwhelming level design. If that happens and they maintain their high quality everywhere else, then I can seriously see that game contending for my favorite Souls-like game of all time. I can seriously see a future where the peak of Souls-like games somehow gets raised again. And against my wildest imagination, it'll be a standard that wasn't made by Fromsoft. Hey, thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I know I said that Doom the Dark Ages would be the next video, but I really like Lies of P and just had to talk about the DLC when a shadow dropped out of nowhere. That video is still coming though, I promise. In fact, I'm thinking of doing a series of videos critiquing the entire one take. I get one take on these. If you didn't know what I do, I basically I can only press the record button once, and after that, yeah, I have to keep it in. Okay, so I'm thinking about doing a trilogy of modern Doom critique videos. But this is pretty much what this paragraph is supposed to be about. I messed it up. I'm not good at talking. You know, it's very hard to do this voice, by the way. How's your mother doing? Don't say that. What if their mom is like dead or some shit? No, wait, hold on. Wait a minute.